Welcome to the conversation. I'm Paul Grondahl, the director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. Really excited about today's guest, James Howard Kunstler, acclaimed author of more than 20 books. In particular, we're here to talk about his latest book called Living in the Long Emergency, Global Crisis, the Failure of the Futurists, and the Early Adapters Who Are Showing Us the Way Forward. Just out by Ben Bella Books. He was scheduled to do an in-store event at Bookhouse Estaios Plaza. One of our great friends, Suzanne, one of the wonderful independent booksellers in our region. We're having a conversation with her, and independent bookstores, as you know, Jim, are really getting hit hard. It was a difficult industry before this pandemic. Now they really need help. So this interview today, and the point we're asking people to go to the Bookhouse website. They have a link to order your book, and it will support your publisher, Ben Bella Books, obviously the author, but most importantly, the independent bookseller. So we're calling this Indie Bookstore Boost, and you're our first guest. Thanks so much, and welcome, Jim.
Hi, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
So your tagline, I've known you for a long time, I should say. I've interviewed you probably a dozen times. Usually when each new book comes out, I always enjoy getting together with you when I've written for the Times Union. But your tagline for a long time has been, "It's all good." You're an optimistic kind of person. Is it still all good in this damn coronavirus pandemic?
Well, it's all good has been kind of a gag. Not completely what it appears to be. But I'm not a complete pessimist. I think reality is giving us a message. It's taking us somewhere, and history is taking us to a certain place. And it's not an altogether bad place, but it's going to be a lot different from the blue light special shopping orgy that we've been living in for the last 40 years. And, it's going to require quite a bit of us.
Right.
The new disposition of things, as I like to call it.
So this book is a follow-up to your 2005 book, The Long Emergency, where you've often been ahead of the curve, and the timing of this book is incredible too. But you were alerting your readers and people who were paying attention of such turmoil coming in politics, in economics. How is this a follow-up, and why did you want to write this book now in this time?
Well, because quite a few things have changed. Although I had a long chapter in The Long Emergency about viruses and epidemic diseases, and that was one of the converging problems, possible cataclysms that we were facing. But we had a very interesting 15 years since then, especially the last decade since the great financial panic of 2008 and all of the troubles that emanated from that. And, that could have been the beginning of the long emergency, but we managed to kind of paper it over and buy ourselves another 10 years. Part of that was the shale oil miracle. And, the shale oil miracle was a very interesting stunt, but it was a stunt. It was a financial stunt. And it was accomplished in the same way that a lot of the papering over of our problems was accomplished by borrowing a lot of money. And the shale oil industry was kind of a Ponzi scheme. They found a technical way to goose a lot of difficult to get oil out of a lot of tight rock, but they did it all with borrowed money at very low interest rates, near zero interest rates, and they never made a buck doing it. They never made a red cent doing it. And now they're in the unfortunate situation. I mean, apart even from the COVID-19 sequester and all of the problems that have emanated from that, the oil companies are in a situation where, having demonstrated for 10 years that they can't make any money producing shale oil, they're not going to get further investment to continue those operations. And that will prove to have been a pretty significant fake out for our culture. So, but that changed the picture because, the peak oil picture before that had been pretty simple. The idea was we were simply going to run out, or at least, have it was going to become increasingly expensive. And it looks like that was how it was going to work out. What we've discovered since then, that there can be many perversities in economics, and the current perversity is that our economy is now failing on a grand scale, and yet oil has never been so cheap in 20 years. The trouble is that even at these cheap rates, the populations of the world are becoming so impoverished that they can't afford to use it or buy it.
Right.
So economics is full of strange ironies, and that's been one of them. But we're undergoing other kinds of failures in this the big picture.
Yeah, the fact that people are driving less, is reason for the glut of oil now. But I think you also brought up, including in your book, The Geography of Nowhere, a wonderful book, that this overbuilt, sprawl, junk culture, I see it now. I mean, the conditions of the roads and the interstate highway system are bad in places because they don't have the money to keep it up. You look at,
Yeah.
I drive past a lot of empty strip mall
Yeah.
storefronts now, and our big mall Crossgates is a lot of empty stores. Imagine what it'll be after this pandemic. So is
It'll
it
be a
also,
mall for zombies.
yeah, so a lot of it is just the overbuilt greed. You've talked about that a lot, not just corporations individually. I mean, this book talks about sort of the culture and the heart and soul of America, and how we've sort of bought into these false things, of success. Talk about that.
Well, when you say overbuilt, that's one way of describing the situation. But to be more precise about it, this is a crisis of excessive hyper complexity and excessive investments and over investments in hyper complexity. And in fact, that was how another author named Joseph Tainter described the situation in his in a book that came out before the long emergency called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And so what we're seeing are the ramifications of that. And what it's telling us is that we're going to have to get simpler. We're going to have to downscale all of our activities, make them less complex, and probably more local. And it's going to change many of the terms of everyday life. A lot of the activities that we have generated probably aren't going to survive. And in interesting ways, the whole car matrix, the whole happy motoring automobile matrix is a very strange and interesting situation. It's not failing right now on the basis of what fuel you use to put in a vehicle, whether it's electric or gasoline or diesel. It's failing on the basis of the middle class, who used to be the customers for all of those cars,
Right.
are now going so broke that they can't afford to buy cars anymore.
Right.
And this was happening well before the COVID-19 virus. Even late last year, or well, before 2019, it was becoming a normal practice for car companies to give 7-year loans for used cars, which were beaters long before the terms of the loan were over.
Right.
And that's how desperate they were to move the merch off the lot. And for years, the middle class, since 2008 especially, for years the middle class have become increasingly distressed.
Right.
And so there are fewer and fewer qualified borrowers to get car loans. And at the same time, because of the activities of the central banks and all of the perversities and deformities of the financial sector, capital is actually disappearing. And so there's less capital for making car loans, and there are fewer qualified buyers. So the whole system, Americans are used to buying cars on installment loans.
Right.
And if that doesn't happen, you don't have a car industry. Chevrolet sold, not Chevrolet, GM sold 7 million units in a normal recent year. You know, they're not going to become a boutique manufacturer selling 1,100 cars a year, you know, or
Right.
1.1 million cars a year. You know, they got to sell a lot of millions of cars. And if they
Right.
don't, there's not going to be a car industry as we've known it. You mentioned the roads. You know, we very slowly and incrementally over a period of a century built this monumental hierarchy of roads and streets and highways and superhighways. And, you know, the phenomenal expense that's involved in maintaining that is just out of this world. So, you know, we're going to see the failure of the system coming from many different angles, and a lot of them are going to be surprising.
We're talking to James Howard Kunstler, acclaimed author and author of a just released book, Living in the Long Emergency, Global Crisis, The Failure of the Futurists, and the Early Adapters Who Are Showing Us the Way Forward, just out by Ben Bella Books. This is part of our indie bookstore boost with the New York State Writers Institute and WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. We're trying to help today a wonderful independent bookseller, Susan Novotny, the Bookhouse at Stuyvesant Plaza. Now, you shared an excerpt with me. I'm just going to call it up. I wonder if I can read just a paragraph of it, because I think it encapsulates a couple things. I've known you a long time. You're a brilliant writer in many genres, but you've also got this great humor, sarcasm, and you write with such a descriptive, fluid way that I've often said, like, I don't agree with you, Jim, but by the end of your book, you've persuaded me to agree with your point of view. So anyway, I'm going to read this section. This is from your chapter 15, Cultural Notes, Fumbling Toward Kafka's Castle. The economically stranded former working class has devolved into a tribe of tattooed savages sunk in anomie. Those who rung up the ladder in the middle class are not far behind them as vocations and incomes disappear, debts mount, and desperation creeps over the scene. Obesity and its byproducts, diabetes, run at record levels thanks to, quote, innovations in the food processing industry and the absence of other traditional social satisfactions that have been destroyed by television and smartphones. Opiate addiction and suicide are the new normal in the, quote, flyover states. The triumphant completion of suburbia has produced yawning ugliness on the landscape, an epidemic of loneliness, family dysfunction, and a dismal cavalcade of mass shootings in public schools. Meanwhile, the upper rungs of society are enfogged in a contrived, obsessive, moral panic over race and sexual relations. That's some amazing writing, also a grim outlook. It feels somewhat to me of your wonderful, very popular blog, Clusterfuck Nation. I think you have a wide, loyal readership, and you can talk about how some of them are featured in this book. So
Yeah.
what is there any kind of common denominator about the people who you've had this conversation going with America really for 10, has it been 10 years, 15 years,
Well,
or
really going on about 20, although it's
20?
evolved
Yeah.
to a, you know, kind of more formal structure from just, you know, originally being just some rants. But
You kind of
yeah,
have the pulse of America. This is what you're feeling. You're kind of reporting back. You've always been a
yeah.
journalist in a way.
Yeah, I've been trying to keep a pulse, you know, keep up with the pulse of where this culture is going, and you could see that it was going to a pretty dangerous and a harsh place for years back, and so I attracted a certain readership, and some of them were people who, you know, I've been writing to for 10, 15 years, so. I decided to go out into the world there and, you know, leave my bat cave and actually interview them and find out how they were living. One of the things they had in common was that they were all people who were independent thinkers. They did share my apprehension that the kind of hologram of existence around them was, you know, an artificial construct that probably was not going to represent real life going down the road some ways.
Right.
And, they had all established a kind of a life for themselves that was uh, intended to be a viable alternative to, being part of the corporate workforce and just the standard zombie American lifestyle. So, they included people from really very different backgrounds. One of them, a couple of them were homesteaders and farmers, and there was a lady who's an artisan baker up in Vermont. There's another guy who was a distiller and farmer. There's a guy who was a white nationalist, and I thought, he's been corresponding with me for years. He's actually not a terrible person, although he's a strange person.
Right.
But I thought that people ought to get a taste of what animated him and what his life had been like and what had propelled him onto this course. I interviewed a guy who had been writing to me for a long time, who was a Black intellectual living in the Baltimore ghetto. He had had an interesting life, and so a podcaster named KMO, who many people I don't know, some people may know him. He has a popular blog and podcast called the C Realm. C stands for consciousness.
Yep.
And he had made a career out of this vocation that never existed before 15 years ago, and had a pretty interesting life. His name is Kevin. And, he had actually started out in his adult life working for the very earliest incarnation of Amazon. He was the first, one of the first office guys in the first office crew that Jeff Bezos put together. And he was working right down the hall from Bezos. And, Bezos apparently had this maniacal laugh. And, he'd hear Bezos laughing maniacally all day long.
Right.
And he left the company fairly early on, and he was already vested in a certain amount of stock.
Wow.
And when he left, he left and cashed out, and he came off with hundreds of thousands of dollars in money at a very early age.
Right.
And then, and that kind of warped his worldview.
Right.
And he went through a lot of incarnations after that. He tried farming in various places. He tried moving to Australia. He bounced all around the country, from Arkansas to Maryland to Vermont to Tennessee, and got married.
Right.
Had children, and went bust, and ended up, as a podcaster.
Yeah.
He did it because it was interesting at first, and it was something that he liked to do. But he started making a buck doing it. He wasn't getting rich,
right?
But unlike a lot of other people in our country now, he was at least making a buck, supporting himself, doing something he liked, and something that was interesting.
I mean, these people all are very interesting. Like you say, free thinkers. Obviously, they're very bright. Yeah. But is there a commonality, or basically they want to get off the grid and they've had enough and they say, screw it, I'm not going to be, part of society or ruled by a government? Or are they
not so much that they didn't want to be part of society, but they wanted to be part of society on their own terms.
Right.
Like Suzanne, the lady who's an artisan baker, she's gone through just one unbelievable life challenge after another to do what she wants to do. She doesn't want to drop out of society. She wants to bake for society, and she wants to do it well. And she wants to be, a really good baker and sell it to her customers and have transactions with society.
Right.
But she wanted to do it well on her own terms. She didn't want to make Wonder Bread in a factory.
Right.
And but what I admired so much about her was her incredible persistence and her bravery. She was a courageous person and strong. She was a person of tremendous strength, although she's actually kind of a tiny woman. So I admired that tremendously about her, and I think all of these people showed a certain kind of strength. Another another chapter was about a couple who were homesteaders out on an island in Puget Sound off of
That's my
the.
home turf, man. I'm from the Puget Sound.
Are you?
Yeah, I got
You
to read
from
it. Yeah.
Seattle?
Seattle. Then my family moved to Tacoma, and they had a little cabin on Puget Sound across from Vashon Island.
Well, they were in Whitby.
Oh, they're in Whitby. Okay, I know where it
Yeah.
is exactly. Wow.
Yeah, and it's way out there. And so they were homesteading out there and in a beautiful place. And they had some problems. The soil was terrible. They were doing everything they possibly could to raise crops. They were creating these things called hugel planting strips, which basically you take a whole lot of organic crap and you put it in a ditch, and over time it turns into soil. But
Right.
you have to do it like diligently for years to make it work. And they were doing all this stuff. They had built a beautiful handmade house. They were making some money on the side as professional musicians. They were both very smart. This is Tom and Suki. Tom was a particularly interesting guy. He had been raised by his grandfather in rural Texas, and his grandfather was basically a redneck intellectual, who would like read the Greek classics to him, but at the same time he was like, a shit kicker.
Right.
And Tom had started out in life as like a drummer in in roadhouse bands, and but he got into technology and he started doing a lot of tech things, and he was just a tremendously talented and ingenious guy who could build anything.
Right.
And Suki had this tremendously rich career doing medical stuff, and she had many careers in one life.
Huh.
So, they're farming out on Whitby Island, and after the book is published, they discovered that the Air Force base on Whitby Island or the naval base has decided to expand, and all of a sudden they're running like 300% more flights right over their house. So they decide to get out.
Yeah.
And they sold their place like 3 months after I saw them, and they moved to Vermont.
There you go.
All across the country, and they bought another homestead.
Wow.
And they started all over again,
Yeah.
and so it was pretty interesting.
So I see a common theme. Like I said, I've known you for, I don't know, 30 years, 35 years. When you were writing for the Knickerbocker News.
Yeah, in 1973, 4.
Right.
Yeah.
You did it, which you turned into a novel. You did a series of articles on, we call them cults, but they're kind of like utopian, outside.
Some of them were cults.
Cults, there you go. So
yeah, they were religious cults.
You've been
hardcore.
Drawn to this strain in American history and culture, the outsider, the off the grid, under the radar. What is it that draws you to that? Even in your fiction, which I wanted to talk about, World Made by Hand or Harrows of Spring, which I've read those novels, that you imagine this post-apocalyptic world, and some of the people you're describing could survive in that world, but a lot of us probably couldn't. What are you drawn to that in the renegade or the outsider or the iconoclast?
Well, it might just come from, the basis of my personality, which is, I'm kind of.
Is there a reason you're in the bunker, Jim?
Well, it's not so much I'm in the bunker, but, I'm still, I'm kind of a rebel. I'm kind of the, the class clown and the rebel. And, I never did too well in the corporate milieu. I never really wanted to follow the rules that much. And so, I made a path for myself, and it was pretty arduous. I dropped out of the journalism racket in 1975. That was my last real corporate job.
Right.
And I did it very deliberately. I basically quit a pretty good job at Rolling Stone.
Yeah, that's hardly corporate, wasn't the
It was corporate. No. It was totally
I thought
corporate.
you was like supplying drugs to Hunter Thompson, and Jan Wenner had you an endless cocktail tab or anything?
No, you'd be surprised. Even in 1974, Rolling Stone was a very corporate place. And in fact, I just happened to read the recent biography of Jan Wenner only like 3 months ago. This is like, 50 years after I was
Right.
there.
Are you mentioned in there?
No, I'm not.
No.
But I mean, I wasn't one of the major players there. But um, in any case, I did. I had come from the Albany newspaper, the evening newspaper, the Nick News, and when I got to Rolling Stone, I discovered that it was much less fun than working on a daily newspaper, and it was very. You would be surprised how straight it was,
Yeah.
and Jan was trying to make it straighter.
Yeah.
In fact, I was part of his campaign of getting rid of the hippie deadweights and getting young professionals in.
Right.
But anyway, I bagged it after a year because, to me, it seemed like a dead end. And, for a young man with literary ambitions back in the 70s, the career track really was to drop out and write novels.
Right.
Right. That was it.
Right.
Even though, I mean, it's hard to believe now. I mean, especially because literature in some ways, and especially the novel, has become kind of a female realm.
Right. But
But
you're in a grand tradition. So many great American novelists started in journalism: Hemingway,
sure,
Spicer, our own William Kennedy.
sure.
I could name a dozen. But when new reporters would come in, I would always invoke Jim Kunstler. You were part of you're part of the pantheon when I tell the story of
Well,
amazing.
Bill Kennedy was for me. I mean, they said the same thing about him.
People have come through here. You had two of the classic stories of all time. When you had your column in the Knickerbocker News, you wrestled a bear and you went fly fishing with full on like fancy Orvis gear in Washington Park Lake, that poor sad little pond. And but you were so imaginative and had wild, out of the box ideas. And in a way, I see in your writing and in this new book, you're drawn to that type, right?
Oh yeah.
You respect them,
Yeah, I do. Even if some of their ideas are, crank ideas, which is the case with a couple of them. So,
I also respect that you practice what you preach. So, before you started writing these post-apocalyptic novels and books that talked about the coming shitstorm, you were preparing yourself. I mean, I've been to your house in Washington County. You could live independently. I mean, you grow your own food. You can produce, eggs and things. Talk about that.
I don't lay them myself, actually.
Exactly.
I leave that to the hands.
But talk about that. That was a conscious decision. So what you write about, you're living it and preparing for it.
Well, yeah, that was as conscious as dropping out of Rolling Stone and riding a motorcycle back east to write books very deliberately. And I could see what was coming, and you could see it coming from a million miles away. You could see that you were living in a kind of a distressed society that was just rolling along, waiting to hit the wall. So in 2011, I'd been living in Saratoga for about 35 years or something, and it also happened that after 9/11, Saratoga was kind of invaded by the hedge funders leaving New York, and they bought up all the real estate, and it was no longer really possible to buy an affordable house in Saratoga.
No, the prices went up fivefold.
Yeah, so I moved across the river to Washington County, found a little place on 3 acres, and you'd be amazed what you can put on 3 acres. So I put up a deer fence, planted about 30 fruit trees, planted a lot of berry bushes, built a substantial garden, put up a hoop house, which is kind of a greenhouse, a plastic covered greenhouse, so you can advance the season a little bit.
Right.
And, put solar on the house, even though I kind of think that, alternative energy is kind of a racket.
Yeah.
But I did that. It may last for just one generation, but it'll outlast me. And I just saw it coming, so I decided to do it. I didn't have tremendous gardening skills. I didn't know much about growing fruit or raising chickens, but I've been able to squeak by with that and make it work.
Well, when I saw it, I was impressed. I mean, you're just like crafting your sentences. You're very meticulous. But talk about, you've got a new pandemic crop list, Russian inspired. What are you growing this spring, Jim?
Oh, that was kind of a gag, but it's also sort of true. It's the the Russian survival garden. Instead of just growing arugula and heirloom tomatoes, this year I'm going heavy on the cabbage and potatoes and onions. Because
Nice.
that, first of all, that stuff keeps over the winter,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
you can at least count on eating vichyssoise between November and April.
But I hear your plum trees were so fruitful. You've got preserved plum preserves coming out of your ears. Are you going to make a
Yeah,
business out of
the
that?
lifetime supply of plum jam. Yeah,
You'll be regular, man. You'll be very regular. I know that.
yeah. Well, it's not prune jam, but it is plum jam. And of course, all these things still rely on a society that's kind of working in the background. Although, I mean, when you consider how people lived here 150, 200 years ago, it was still, they still got by, and they didn't have Walmarts. You got to think about things like, how do you make jam without sugar?
Right.
Well, you got to have sugar. And years and years ago, in our great great grandfather's time, the sugar was being, made by slaves in Louisiana and the Caribbean.
Right.
And how are we going to get it in the future? We don't know. We may not have that. We may have to get by with a whole lot less. So uh, I tried to puzzle a lot of that out in that novel series, which I called the World Made by Hand novel series, after the first
Right.
one of the first title of the series. And I had projected that we would be in some kind of a long emergency within about 10 or 20 years. And we seem to have entered one. And
Yeah, I know.
that's one of the ironies of the current situation for me is, I published Living in the Long Emergency exactly the moment that coronavirus hit and the economy just stopped all over the world.
Right. But
And
but
perhaps in a way that is, not going to restart the way it was before.
but you're
So,
prepared. You've been preparing this, like you say, for 10 plus years. So you got
yeah,
everything in your store laid in. So I want to ask you, of all the people, your work is solitary writing. You can
yeah.
garden by yourselves. You can be self-sufficient. You were kind of prepared. Is this pandemic difficult for you? Are you finding you're just as productive or
Well, I'm in an unusual situation because what I've done, who I am, my books and all of a sudden I become real popular overnight. I've been in the wilderness for about 12 years because, the long emergency that I wrote about in 2005 didn't happen instantly, and
right,
people were very disappointed. And so I've been kind of left behind, forgotten. And all of a sudden, my volume of email is completely overwhelming me. I can barely find time to finish it all day and do other things.
right,
I'm doing a lot of interviews with, radio stations and bloggers, podcasters,
right,
I'm publishing my blog twice a week in my own podcast, and I've got other books to write. So I couldn't be busier.
yeah,
Um, I couldn't be busier.
yeah,
I'm very fortunate, and um, I'm getting by. I do make a little bit of money off of my blog. I'm not getting rich doing that, but at least
right,
I am. And maybe I won't after a certain amount of time because my readers are going to go broke. Um,
right,
so it's a pretty dicey situation. Luckily, I did make some money during the fat years when I was on the lecture circuit. That kind of stopped about 2013 when the wokesters took over the universities. I
you're
became,
not woke. I think of you as woke,
yeah, well, I'm woke in a different way.
but
And
in your
I wasn't woke enough in that way. And it,
in your subtitle, you talk about early adapters. I've always thought of you as an early adapter with your podcast, with your blog. You've also were early on Patreon. Is that
yeah.
sustainable? Is that actually,
Well, like I just said, I don't know.
yeah,
It had been, I was basically paying the light bill off of Patreon because at the same time that happened, book advances started going way down.
right,
You know, the only people who were getting book advances were the Obamas, and they were getting like 60 million.
right,
Everybody else was getting $12,000, for 3 years of work,
right,
right? So you're basically getting paid less than a junior high school part-time janitor for writing books.
Yeah.
So luckily,
So,
lucky, and the thing about the blog is, I think the blog is pretty high quality, and pretty good. But the main thing about it is that it's regular. You know,
right.
it comes out rain or shine, twice a week, Monday and Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it is always there. I wrote the gosh darn thing even when I came out of open heart surgery. I didn't miss one blog that week that that they cracked my chest open, took my heart out, put it on a table, and, attached a couple of magical things to it and stuffed
Jesus.
it back in my chest.
This is why you're early journalism training. You don't miss a deadline. I mean, journalists, those are deadlines are everything. I am
Yeah.
amazed that you have sustained it this long, and 2 a week is not easy, and all the other things you're doing. You got to go out and weed the rows, man.
Well, in fact, this morning, I had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to put the blog up, which is a little earlier than I usually do, because I had to meet a woman in the Walgreens parking lot and buy 2 hens from her. At 10:15
Is
or
that the hen
something.
black market?
Well, sort of, yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it's anything illicit, but that's how that. I mean, interestingly, that's the beginning of how things are done in a world made by hand. Is
Right.
you need 2 hens.
Yeah.
You go meet somebody and you trade them something for it. In this case, I gave her $20.
Right.
Who knows what it'll be in 5 years?
It'll be barter, man. All those cabbages and potatoes you're
There you
growing,
go.
they'll be wanting those. So the book is called Living in the Long Emergency, Global Crisis, The Failure of the Futurists, and the Early Adapters Who Are Showing Us the Way Forward, just published by Ben Bella Books. This is part of our new effort called Indie Bookstore Boost, Indie Bookstore Boost, trying to help independent booksellers. Just a couple of words about, in particular, I know you have known and been a friend of Susan Novotny a long time, as I have too. What would you say about why important, bookstores? You support Battenkill Books in near where you live, and talk
Mhm.
about the importance of independent bookstores and why people should, one, buy your book now from Bookhouse, but also support indie booksellers.
Well, I think independent retail and small local retail is going to be the wave of the future anyway. People don't realize it. And a lot of the so-called pundits and experts who are writing in the magazines now, uh, in fact, there was just one the other day, basically saying nobody will be left but the giants. And in fact, I think it's just the opposite. The giants are going to go down because their business model is not going to work in the post long emergency pandemic world. And they're already going down, obviously. The malls and the chain stores are all in trouble. So we got to support local people who run local businesses. It's terribly important. And luckily, independent booksellers have been there all through this. They bravely survived the onslaught of the giants, and they're still there. And we got to keep them alive as long as we possibly can, so that they can be part of the new disposition of things, which will be downscaled local life lived in the USA.
Well said. We're really grateful you joined this conversation today. James Howard Kunstler. The new book is called Living in the Long Emergency, Global Crisis, The Failure of the Futurists, and the Early Adapters Who Are Showing Us the Way Forward. There will be a link on this directly to Bookhouse of Stuyvesant Plaza, and we hope you'll purchase the book, support the wonderful author who we've had this conversation with, but in particular, the independent bookseller. So thanks a lot, Jim. I hope you have a great spring gardening season, and it's good to talk with you again, buddy.
Okay, buddy. Paul, if you want to come up and help me weed the rutabagas and
I
the
would.
cabbages and onions,
I want to see your place again. So I meet you in the parking lot with like 2 small guinea hens or something? Or...
Sure.
All right,
I could always use. They like to eat ticks. I'd like to have some
I'll
guinea
bring
hens.
hand sanitizer, but can we make any kind of alcohol out of all those plums? Can you
Oh
make...
gosh, you can make it out of anything.
Okay. All
You can
right,
even
man.
make it out of hand sanitizer.
That's true. All right. Thanks a lot. It's all good, man.
Okay,
Thanks.
Paul, it's all good.
See ya.